أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the next episode in my reminder about the abolition of the Khilafah 100 years since the 3rd of March 1924 to the 3rd of March 2024. In our part one, we talked about the importance of this subject. Part two was discussing the role of Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, how he rose to power briefly, we discussed, and also the ideas that he was affected by, and also the reaction of Muslims around the world to the abolition of the Khilafah. So we're going to now talk about some of the ideas that led to problems within the Ottoman Khilafah, which sowed the seeds for the ultimate abolition and destruction. I'm going to add slides to the presentation mainly for my own benefit. We have two things here. We're going to talk about nationalism and secularism. Secularism means the separation of religion from matters of state and politics and governance. And the reason I have this flag here when I look at nationalism is this is not the Palestinian flag. This is actually the flag of the Arab revolt that was used in the First World War to incite Arab nationalism. And actually the color scheme which was selected, it is said it's selected by Sir Mark Sykes, who was a British diplomat. The color scheme is one that has been replicated in many national flags of Arab countries, including the Palestinian flag. So that's just a side point. So when we talk about how we got to the ultimate abolition of the Khilafah and we look at some of the background, we're going to today look at ideas, particularly nationalism and secularism, and how they managed to manifest in the Ottoman Khilafah and how they affected the society there. And also then in future discussions in part 5 and 6, we'll talk about other internal political schisms and also external factors, particularly the role of colonialist states. So as I said, we're talking about nationalism and secular ideas. And it's an important lesson here. Ideas are not neutral things. In one of our previous discussions, we talked about how some Ottoman thinkers tried to reconcile ideas of nationalism and the nation state with the Islamic idea of the caliphate, thinking that sometimes these institutions like the nation state, like, for example, a democratic parliament or a democratic republic, are neutral tools by which states identify or governance happens, but they're actually not. They are very particular to a European framework of thinking, and therefore they need to be judged according to an Islamic criteria if we're going to understand them properly. So in Europe, there had been this discussion over a period of time about the nature of the state and democracy, framing politics in either Hobbesian terms, meaning that the ruler, usually in Europe it would be the king or the prince, had a divine right to rule, and that ultimate authority meant that, you know, he shouldn't be challenged, he shouldn't be rebelled against, that he held all power effectively. Or in terms of ideas from John Locke, Hobbesian ideas meaning from Thomas Hobbes, or Lockean ideas from John Locke, where actually the authority of a ruler comes from the people largely, and so evolves ultimately into the kind of idealistic democratic society where the ruler is accountable and changed regularly. These are very, very European ideas, and they evolved out of a European philosophy about ruling. Similarly, nationalism arose, and the idea of the nation state arose from the conflict between the temporal authority, the princes and the kings and queens of Europe, and the ruling authority of the Catholic Church and the ultimate authority of the Pope. Conflict over years and years and years of war, ultimately settled with the Peace of Westphalia, where effectively every region was given its territorial boundaries, and the temporal ruler within that was said to have the ultimate authority. So these ideas started to emerge, and coupled with that, you saw a weakness in the understanding of Islam, a weakness in ijtihad, particularly on issues relating to governance, economy, worldly things, if you like. So European states had, now these ideas don't happen in a vacuum. The interrelationship between the ideas and the political influence of states outside needs to be understood. So while we're going to talk later in other episodes about external factors, they are related here as well. So European states, Russia, as well, attempted to incite nationalism and separatism in parts of the Ottoman Khilafah, in Serbia, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, Greece, and other places. So this led to rebellions, secessionist movements. Now, the Ottoman state is famous for the fact that its citizens were majority non-Muslim, but for a long periods of time, they lived as citizens and there was stability. But this incitement of separatism and nationalism was more done in the areas where there were larger non-Muslim populations. So hence Serbia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece. Turkish nationalism was a relatively late thing. So this is a quote from Bernard Lewis, famous American Orientalist, not a great friend of Islam, but he describes in his book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, in the 19th century, the Turks thought of themselves primarily as Muslims. Their loyalty belonged to Islam and not to the Ottoman state. The term Ottoman was not understood in any national sense, but in a dynastic sense, like Umayyad, Abbasid, Seljuk. The concept of an Ottoman nation, an Ottoman fatherland, as a foci of national and patriotic loyalty were 19th century innovations under European influence. So you're talking about the 1800s here. Yeah? They were of brief duration. The Turks showed little national consciousness. So if you remember in one of our previous episodes, you had a guy called Ziya Golkep, who was a thinker in the Ottoman times, very influenced by ideas of nationalism, who was talking about we need to hark back to a kind of authentic Turkish nationalism. Well, Lewis is saying there was no real national consciousness amongst Turks. Ottomans had no racial arrogance or exclusiveness, no insistence on pure Turkish descent. Islam was the entry requirement, which opened the door to real power, societal status, to Albanian, Greek, Slav, as well as to Kurd and Arab. So interesting quote from Bernard Lewis here. So Turkish nationalism arose relatively late. It grew stronger during the late half of the, very late part, not half, very late part of the 19th century, the late 1800s, and then in the early 1900s. Abdul Hamid II, the last real authentic Khalifa of Islam, tried to unite the Ottoman Khilafah and reach out to Muslims around the world through what they called pan-Islamism. So he was not really focused on a Turkish identity, he was focused on an Islamic identity, and also through that would define the relationship of all citizens, because as we know, those of us who study this, and we will look at this in later discussions, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he arrived in Medina to establish the first Islamic polity, the first Islamic state, he drew up a contract known as the Sahifa between himself and all the different communities in the city. Some were Muslim, some were non-Muslim, and effectively he gave rights and responsibilities to everyone, though the responsibilities on the Muslims in terms of engagement in the military, paying of zakat, were obviously greater because there was a specific thing that Islam gave to them. So an interesting kind of thinking and a different political idea, if you like, of how, and Lewis's quote, I think, is very powerful in how it explains and defines how Islam also, even the declined era of Islam under the Ottomans, had no racial arrogance or exclusiveness, no insistence on pure Turkish descent. Very powerful quote, which illustrates really how Islamic ideas of citizenship, of relationships between people, define themselves in a real world polity. So this real world polity was undermined by different nationalisms in Serbia, in Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece, eventually Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism. Now, when we look at Turkish and Arab nationalism, you can see this manifest politically most strongly in two rebellions. One was by the Al Saud family. The Al Saud tribe first started inciting and attacking in Kuwait in 1788, and later in 1803 to 1804 they attacked Mecca and Medina. Ultimately they were repelled, even though I think they had some successes in the early days. Brutal, bloodthirsty attacks, by the way, very, 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 very brutal. They attacked Damascus and Aleppo. Damascus was vigorously defended. Aleppo fell for a period of time. They exploited the Wahhabi school of thought for their own aims, and so they justified a lot of their rebellion based on theological doctrine taken from this school of thought. So they used that to justify a lot of the bloodshed and destruction that they caused and rebellion that they did. But they ultimately took assistance from the British. Sorry, I've got a misprint in my thing here. I should have corrected that. They took assistance from the British, but they were ultimately repelled by the governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, in that period. Though later they again incited rebellion in 1891 and 1901, by which time the assistance from the UK was very apparent, and they were promoted by Britain to declare their kingdom in 1932. The other really powerful political manifestation of Arab nationalism was through the Sharif of Mecca, who led the Arab revolt. That flag that we saw at the beginning of the presentation was the flag that he used. So he was the governor of Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca. It was a hereditary thing. He was loyal to the Ottomans at the time of Abdul Hamid, but he became disloyal as the Young Turks grew to power, and secular and nationalistic ideas became more apparent in the Ottoman Khilafah, and consequently more damaging. So those ideas alienated the Sharif of Mecca, who then got into correspondence with Sir Henry McMahon, a British High Commissioner in Egypt, where he incited a rebellion against the Ottoman Khilafah during World War I, very dangerously creating a second front for the Ottomans. He was assisted by T.E. Lawrence, the British officer, intelligence officer, to fuel that Arab revolt. And he expected after the war to be offered Arab lands like Palestine, the Hijaz, Bilad al-Sham. But then, those lands were also offered to the French and also to the Zionists in terms of Palestine. He took money from the British and the Ottomans simultaneously. And ultimately, I believe he was the cause of the downfall and the loss of Jerusalem in World War I, of Damascus, of Baghdad, and ultimately the Haramain fell to the Saudis. His family were eventually recompensed with the Kingdom of Jordan. Briefly, they were given kingdoms in Syria and Iraq, but they were proved, and Egypt, but they proved unsustainable because they were artificial entities which were not really accepted by people, hence easy to challenge. I put this quote up. It's said to be an Arab quote. If two fish in the Tigris are fighting, look for the Englishman, because it just illustrates that in the Arab revolts and Arab rise of Arab nationalism, the strong influence of foreign ideas and political interference by the British. Now, ideas spread into the Ottoman Khilafah through various centers which were established in Istanbul, in Beirut, in Bilad al-Sham, in Malta, and in particularly in Beirut and in Cairo, there were the American universities as well. There's a pattern here. The pattern is that often missionaries or thinkers from the outside would come in and start mixing, particularly with Christian Arab communities in these places, or with Turks in the case of Istanbul Center. And there they would introduce ideas about Arab nationalism, about secular ideas, and the influence of these thoughts would grow through a certain class of people. So in Istanbul, you saw senior leaders of the Young Turks who actually were influenced in London or Paris, but when they came back to Istanbul and to the Ottoman lands, they would start spreading their ideas, and eventually their movement grew. In Beirut, there was a Father Louis Sheikho, a Maronite priest who was present in the UK for a while, and when he went back, he started introducing new teaching methods. In Bilad al-Sham, which means Syria, the Levant, Francis Marash, Cornelius van Dyck, Nasif al-Yajiz, who had a movement called Nahda, or Arab Awakening, Boutros Boustani, he worked in the American Embassy. Both Nasif and Boutros were known to Van Dyck, who was an American, and they both set up the Syrian Scientific Society, which became a forum for discussing these ideas and introducing ideas into the mix of ideas that would have been discussed at those times. And remember what I said, that often the ideas of Islam that could have been used to debate the merits of ideas that these people were bringing were not strongly understood in this era of decline. Eli Smith in Malta, and as I said, the American universities of Beirut and Cairo were established at these times. Secular ideas need to be understood from the context of where we're at. So we're talking about the Ottoman Khilafah in the 1800s, the 19th century, and that's where some of these ideas start to grow. Look at the 18th century, the context. So up till the 18th century, you don't really have a really strong understanding of secular ideas manifest in the world. But you've got 2 centuries over the 18th and 19th century of real global political change in ideas. So you have 1707, the Act of Union in the UK, which effectively settled a lot of the religious and territorial conflicts in the UK. You've got the 1776 Declaration of Independence in the US, which effectively caused the separation of the United States as a colony of Britain and established its own political principles upon that framework. You've then got the French Revolution, about a decade or two after that, 1789 to 99, and then from 1799 to 1815, you've got the rise and fall of Napoleon. So you have a lot of debate and change and flux going on in Europe in this 100-year period, which then settles on a certain form of political structure. And this was associated in the minds of observers with the material progress that Europe seemed to have achieved and the relative peace of Europe compared to what it had been prior to this period. So it's important to understand these ideas achieved something by the 19th century for Europe, which had a period of flux and chaos for centuries beforehand. And now these ideas, which are exported to the whole of the world, particularly to the Muslim world, there's an assumption that they're good for everyone. Whereas where I've said before, when Islam was at the heart of governance and the identity in the Muslim world, you actually see a flourishing of civilization, peace and harmony between its citizens, much more. And as Islam was removed from that, you see more problems arise. Whereas in Europe, where they were in conflict for hundreds of years, this secular settlement ultimately brought them a century or two of some stability. There were Ottoman thinkers who were affected by this. Rifa' Rafi al-Tahtawi, Khairuddin al-Tunsi, and also known as Khairuddin Pasha, who looked at the ideas of the nation state and governance and seeing how they could bring about change within the Ottoman Khilafah. So this is quite a lot later. So you've got these changes happening through the 1700s, some settlement in Europe of a model of secular and national polities in Europe at that period, secular national states, and these guys by the late 1800s starting to adopt these ideas and thinking that's the way to bring about good change in the Ottoman Khilafah. There were very well-known reformers in this era who were partially affected by some of these things. So Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who was a reformer as he saw it, he did not attack the institution of Khilafah, but he opposed the autocracy of the Sultanate. And he held the Khilafah should pass on from the Ottomans to an Arab and should be based in Mecca. Khilafah, by the way, was never based in Mecca as a capital, of course. It was always based in Medina when it was in Hijaz, and then moved out of Hijaz as the center of political gravity moved. He approved reforms, but didn't think he approved the reforms of the Ottoman because he didn't think they went far enough. He was seen as pan-Islamist and anti-colonial, but his ideas, political ideas, lacked clarity. So when I said before, you need to understand that ideas aren't always neutral. So he would look at parliamentary democracy and almost equate it with shura without understanding that actually a parliamentary democracy has a role beyond that of consultation and giving an opinion and holding to account. It has an aspect of legislation. He also seemed to confuse the admiration for strong anti-colonial leaders with the idea of good governance and an awareness about diplomacy and politics. Muhammad Abdu was an Egyptian scholar who was based in Al-Azhar, and he is somebody who felt that the traditional Islamic approach to thinking was not solving problems. So maybe he recognized problems that existed in his time, but his solution was to abandon the traditional approach and start to reform thinking and doing what you might call a quote unquote neo-ijtihad. The problem was it was very biased towards a European type thinking. He had traveled to Europe and was very favorably impressed by what he saw in Europe, and he wanted to see the Muslim world similarly progressed. So in fact, this guy was praised by one of the leading colonialists of the time, Evelyn Baring, Lord Cromer, as a man of broad and enlightened views who recognized the necessity for European assistance in the work of reform. So you can see, even if he had sincere intentions to start off with, he allowed his reform agenda to be hijacked by a European plan to secularize the Muslim world. Another thinker who, like Abdu, had traveled to the West and had an effect on this is Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, who criticized the Ottoman Empire and actually influenced the idea of Arab nationalism, the calling for sovereignty of Arab nations. And he had been influenced by both Afghani and Abdu. And he, as I say, he had a desire to focus on legal texts rather than legal opinion, but he actually influenced people towards Arabism. Ali Abdul Raziq was later, he had studied at Azhar and Abdu, so you can see the influence on him. But then he went to Oxford in 1912, and when he came back, he wrote an infamous book called Islam and the foundations of governance, al-Islam wa usul al-hukm. This was seen as so controversial and so way out of Islam that the scholars of Al-Azhar dissected it, refuted it, and ultimately thought it was such a poor work that they actually stripped him of his scholarly credentials. Marmaduke Pickthall was a Muslim who was very sympathetic to the Turks. In a book, With the Turk in Wartime, he could see how some people from the Ottoman Khilafah were infatuated with Western people. And he was very pleasantly surprised when he met people there who were not. So this is a quote from him. "When I hear English people talking of the Turks as hopeless, with no vitality left in them, no enthusiasm, no prospects, I can only think they have never met the young men of Turkey, or have met only those who have been educated amongst Europeans. In this opinion, I am hardened by the fact that all the young Ottoman men of my acquaintance informed me that I was the first European with whom they'd ever held much conversation. Whereas the other type of youth inclines to seek out Europeans and adopt this cynical and hopeless standpoint towards the Muslim world." So he's basically saying those young men who he met, who had very little exposure to Europeans, who didn't actively seek out Europeans, they were people that enjoyed discussing with him. They were people that he did not see as hopeless and backward, and rather the ones who had encountered Europeans often adopted a similar cynical attitude to them. And maybe perhaps one of these who adopted those attitudes was this man who we discussed last time, Mustafa Kemal, who in this kind of rather absurd picture, which was taken of him when he visited the West, showed like almost like how almost comically these guys like adopted a European superficial appearance because they're so impressed by what they saw in Europe, and hence when they came back to the Khilafah and they're trying to push European ideas and pushing against, frankly, an open door, because Islamic thought to refute nationalism and secularism and show the weaknesses of these, where the weaknesses of these ideas emerge and where the strength of Islamic ideas emerge, was not well developed enough at that time. There were thinkers writing about it. There were thinkers aware of it. We've mentioned before Sheikh Mustafa Sabri Effendi, but they were fewer and far between. And there really was not the intellectual environment to push back, as there is very manifest in the world today. So some lessons here. Be careful who you trust. Missionaries from colonial countries, geopolitical rivals, influenced the rise of secular and nationalistic thinking in the Ottoman Khilafah. Be careful what you're impressed by. Uncritical mindsets very often fall into being impressed by people who seem to superficially have more material progress, and that really isn't a very good thing to be impressed by. Remember, ideas aren't neutral. They need to be measured against Islam to see whether or not they are indeed neutral tools that can be deployed where you need to, or for the benefit of the people, or whether they actually have a linked to some philosophical underpinning which is different. I've talked about be careful who you trust, be careful who you're impressed by. Don't judge situations from a Eurocentric perspective. Nation states, nationalism, secularism are ideas that emerge in Europe because of the particular European experience. And don't try to make changes that are just Sharia compliant. Some of these thinkers like Abdu, Afghani, Kawakibi, their quote unquote ijtihad or their pseudo ijtihad basically tried to make Western thinking, political thinking particularly, more Sharia compliant, rather than really going to Quran and Sunnah and seeing how that leads you to help solve problems. And a reminder here, before we move on, before we end, of a quote that I gave in a previous episode of this from March 1924, 100 years ago, the abolition of the Caliphate. The repudiation of the Caliphate by the Turks marks an epoch in the expansion of Western ideas over the non-Western world. For our Western principles of national sovereignty and self-government are real forces to which the unfortunate Abdulmajid Effendi has fallen victim, both by tradition and by theory. He says, they say, the Caliph is an absolute monarch, which is not true, over a united Muslim world, which should be true, and it is therefore almost impossible to find a place for him in the nation state, whether it be called a republic or a constitutional monarchy, in which sovereignty is vested in the parliamentary representatives of people. So what we see here is an understanding that Western political ideas were spread actively to the East and were adopted by some people. And ultimately, that was a contributing factor to the demise of the Khilafah. And ultimately, if you believe that, it's also a contributing factor to the conflict, to the war, to the bloodshed, to the competition over resources, to the despotism and instability that has affected the Muslim world and many other parts of the world as well. Because that project, which the Economist clearly talks about, is one that actually failed till today, because none of these parts of the world have really adopted these Western ideas in a way of conviction. And more people are looking to alternatives. More and more people look to the experience of the United States, polarized between Trump and Biden and their followers, or within Europe to the populist far right and the liberal elites, polarized between these two forces, and seeing many examples of where governance is not working around the world. It's certainly, even though the European experience or the American experience is more functional than other parts of the world, it certainly isn't seen as the role model that it once was. So there's some food for thought for us to understand how ideas can affect us, and ultimately how we as Muslims need to be measuring these ideas against Islamic ideas, and where people put forward the strengths of nationalism, of trying to unite people around a certain idea. We need to actually counter that with how ideas like nationalism divide people. They don't allow for the modern world for the transfer of people from many different parts of the world so well. They cause divisiveness and division rather than the sharing of resources. And contrast that with what Bernard Lewis even said about how the Ottomans, even in their declined era, were. Similarly with secularism, the idea that in Europe, the separation of governance from Christianity was something that brought them stability. But actually, ultimately, when you look at many of the problems that exist in secular societies, the loneliness, the individualism, the breakdown of family life, you can see that they literally did throw out the baby with the bathwater. And there's a drive in the world today to seek other ways of looking at things. And really, that's where we in future need to start exploring Islamic ideas and how Islamic civilization had a functional role in this. So I hope that was a useful thing, inshallah, and I do look forward to doing another episode shortly. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.